Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ. And today marks officially the launch of Catholic History 101, where I'll be going through historical events and what are the truths to be found there and some interesting facts here and there. So in today's topic, we're going through is the Quartodeciman controversy. Now, what is the Quartodeciman controversy? So the Quartodeciman controversy was in regards to the celebration of Easter. At the behest of Pope St. Victor I, both synods, East and West, were gathered to establish a consensus on a day which celebration of Easter should take place. So both East and West synods decreed that Easter should be celebrated on the first Sunday of the week, on which the 14th day of Nisan fell. Now, the 14th day of Nisan is basically in the Jewish calendar, in which it took place when the Passover was still celebrating, and because we know that Jesus died during the Passover, the Pesach, and he resurrected around the timing where the Passover was still ongoing. Now, however, not all bishops were agreed to this consensus that's been made between the East and the West, because in Asia, the Asiatic bishops, what they did is that they convened a synod in Ephesus under the direction of Polycrates of Ephesus, and decided that Easter should be celebrated on the 14th day of Nisan rather than the first Sunday of the week. And so Polycrates of Ephesus wrote to Pope St. Victor I, and he says here, "Moreover, I also, Polycrates, who am the least of you all, in accordance with the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I have succeeded, 7 of my relatives were bishops, and I am the 8th. And my relatives always observed the day when the people put away the leaven. I, myself, brethren, I say, who am 65 years old in the Lord and have fallen in with the brethren in all parts of the world, and have read through all holy scripture, am not frightened at the things which are said to terrify us. For those who are greater than I have said, we ought to obey God rather than men." So what happened afterwards is that Pope St. Victor I threatened excommunication to the to the Asian bishops, because they're not willing to follow what was agreed with the synods of both East and West, because all the other bishops, they say that we should celebrate Easter on the first Sunday of the 14th day of the sun, rather than on the day itself of the 14th day of the sun. So Eusebius of Caesarea records this in his famous work, The Histories, where he says that thereupon Victor, who presided over the church at Rome, immediately attempted to cut off from the common unity the parishes of all Asia, with the churches that agreed with them as heterodox. And he wrote letters and declared all the brethren there wholly excommunicate. So Pope St. Victor I intervened, and he gave a ruling saying that they are excommunicated. Now, what happened afterwards was not foretold, because we actually do not know how the controversy was handled in the end, but it went on until the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where the Asian bishops stopped the practice, and then they actually followed what the East and the Western synods have previously agreed upon. So now, what do the scholars say about this event? So the first scholar that we have here is J.N.D. Kelly, who is an Anglican patristic scholar, And he writes there, his action, Pope St. Victor I, provoked a storm of protests, and St. Irenaeus of Lyons, whose church accepted his ruling, sharply reminded him that all previous popes, down to Soter, had shown indulgence to the Quartodeciman practice at a time when Rome itself did not celebrate an Easter festival, and the discrepancy was therefore all the more glaring. It is not clear how Victor reacted, but his demarque was a striking example, going beyond the impersonal action of Clement I at Corinth, of a pope claiming the right to interfere in other churches. So J.N.D. Kelly understood that Pope St. Victor I was not acting like he is the first among equals, because he already understood that he is not first among equals, because the first among equals cannot interfere with other churches, just in the same way the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Archbishop of Canterbury of the Anglican Church, they are unable to interfere with other churches because they carry the title of first among equals. And so he also understood that the Pope is not limited to, the Pope's jurisdiction is not limited to his own city, which is in Rome, is the metropolis, and it's not limited to just the West, nor the country of Italy, but he extends his jurisdiction over the other churches. And this is something that even the Anglican historian Henry Chadwick recognized, that Pope St. Victor I was an example of jurisdiction being carried out outside of the West. And we have another one by Father Adrian Foteku. And what does he say here? So Father Adrian Foteku is a Catholic priest, and he says here, all the same, we have again the situation that a bishop of Rome in the 2nd century claims the right to use real jurisdiction over Christians in Asia, that no one denies his claim, though they thought he had better not do so in this case. So when Pope St. Victor I threatened the Asian bishops with excommunication, they did not question his authority, and neither did St. Irenaeus also question his authority, but rather St. Irenaeus urged Pope St. Victor I to show them mercy, and also to be prudent, because according to St. Irenaeus of Lyons, he feels that what Pope St. Victor I did was imprudent, and it's not because he's questioning his authority as the Bishop of Rome, or as the Supreme Pontiff, or as the Vicar of Christ, but rather he asked him to show mercy and be prudent, make the right choice. So perhaps offer another alternative. And then the next one that we have is a Protestant historian by the name of Philip Schaff. And now Philip Schaff even writes here, he says, but a century later, the Bishop of Rome was substituted for the Church of Rome when Victor, in his own name, excommunicated the churches of Asia Minor for a trifling difference of ritual. So he's talking about the Quartodeciman controversy. From this hierarchical assumption, there was only one step towards the papal absolutism of Leo and Hildebrand, and this found its ultimate doctrinal climax in the Vatican dogma of papal infallibility. Now, this is surprising coming from Philip Schaff, because Philip Schaff is an anti-Catholic, and he is no big fan of the papacy. He's no big fan of Catholicism, but yet he's willing to admit that there is a form of authority that is being played here. And he doesn't deny that what Pope St. Victor I did was definitely some sort of like a papal absolutism, a papal authority that's being laid out there. And it's not just Philip Schaff only, because we also have Beresford Kidd, who is an Anglican priest and historian. Now, Beresford Kidd served as the warden of the Keble College of Oxford from 1928 to 1939, and this is one of his works. But his most famous works was there was the history of the church to AD 461, and he says here, at no point in its history is this preeminence primacy so evident as under Pope Victor 189 to 90, when from Gaul to Osrhoene, I apologize if I can't pronounce this word, on the Euphrates, his invitation for the summoning of councils to effect a settlement of the Paschal controversy was everywhere accepted. This initiative of Pope Victor alone, an initiative proved to be effective, suffices to show how evident in those ancient times was the exceptional situation and the ecumenical authority of the Roman Church. So, just like Philip Schaff and J.N.D. Kelly, he also does admit there is that authority that's being carried out by the Pope. The Pope has jurisdiction, not just his own diocese, right? Not just Rome or in the West, but also in the East as well. And the last piece of evidence that I have is a very renowned Eastern Orthodox theologian, and he's by far one of my favorite and well-respected Eastern Orthodox individual, and his name is Father Alexander Schmemann. Now, before I talked about what he writes about the Pope Saint Victor I, he actually spent most of his time in America, and Father Alexander Schmemann was born in Estonia, and he comes from a family where I think his mom was I think she was part of the Russian Revolution, if I'm not wrong. I may be mistaken. And he's served as the dean of the St. Vladimir Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York since 1982. And this seminary, the St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, became the very heart, the very center of Orthodox theological studies. Now, Father Alexander Schmemann published dozens of books, such as For the Life of the World, Sacraments and Orthodoxy, Introduction to Liturgical Theology, Ultimate Questions, Church, World Mission, Eucharist, Sacrament of the Kingdom, and many other works. So Father Alexander Schmemann was popular in liturgical theology. He's a terrific writer and a very well-respected individual in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Oh, and by the way, he was also present in the Second Vatican Council. He was actually one of the observers there as well. He died in 1983 at the age of 62. Yeah. So what he says about Pope Saint Victor I. Okay. So he says here, but alarming signs appeared very early. The Roman bishops were more and more inclined to regard their primacy, which no one disputed, as a special power, and their presiding in love as presiding in power and authority. Thus, in 192, Pope Victor demanded in an ultimatum that the Eastern churches accept the Roman practice of celebrating Easter. So you may be thinking, wow, how can the Eastern Orthodox admit that, okay, the Pope has also authority over the Eastern churches? Because for the Eastern Orthodox, they actually don't believe that the Pope has universal jurisdiction over the other churches. And what he says here is indeed a fact. It's the truth. And notice he uses the phrase there, presiding in love. That is what St. Ignatius of Antioch says in his letter to the Romans, that the city of Rome where the Pope resides, he's presiding in love. So he's using that phrase that St. Ignatius of Antioch uses in his epistles. But that's something really interesting here. That even though Father Alexander Schmemann didn't really believed in papal jurisdiction. He didn't really believe in the papacy because he has that understanding of the Eastern Orthodox view of the papacy. But yet, what we see here is an example of an honest papal critic, an honest Eastern Orthodox theologian who is willing to admit, who speaks the truth, that hey, there is a jurisdiction being played around there, that the jurisdiction is not limited to just only in the West, nor or in Rome, but he extends his jurisdiction over the Eastern churches. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, you enjoyed this lesson. And if you want to know more about all of this, you can read some books, like for example, The Papacy by Eric Ibarra, because he also goes through this topic also as well. There's also other sources out there that you can also read. And I will see you all in the next time. God bless.